What was the experience of 1968? Where were you and what were you doing? How did the worldwide struggle register in your activism? So please, Angela.
Well, I remember where I was in 1968. I was studying as a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego. I was studying with Herbert Marcuse. I was also organizing in the city of Los Angeles. I was a member of the Black Panther Party, and because of some difficulties in relation to the Black Panther Party, I became a member of Los Angeles SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And then, later, I joined the Communist Party. This is between the fall of '67 and the summer of '68. I'll tell you what I was doing when Martin Luther King was assassinated. That was April 4th, 1968. So of course that predates the uprisings here in Paris. And the assassination occasioned a whole number of uprisings in cities all over the US. I was involved at that particular moment in organizing a campaign against racist police violence, the same thing we're talking about today. And when I found out about the assassination of Dr. King, I was actually printing a poster, a wanted poster, for a white cop who had killed a young black man in LA. As a member of SNCC, we learned that the Los Angeles Police Department had developed some new militaristic strategies, and that they were planning to use the occasion of the response to the assassination of Dr. King in order to introduce these new strategies. And so our goal was to try to do as much organizing of the community that would, in effect, attempt to channel the anger in ways that were productive, and to avoid creating targets for the police. Our local struggles were very much informed by what was happening around the world. Of course, the Cuban Revolution, the Black liberation struggles in other places, the African liberation movements, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique. And we had the sense that the revolution was around the corner. And it was a wonderful sense of urgency, because we knew that we were in the process of being involved in an anti-capitalist, anti-racist. We had yet incorporated gender in the way we should have into our framework. But we were very clear that we were about to make a revolution.
Again, lots of things happened, as Angela has said, in 1968. It was a truly internationalist year. But the period, I think, that opened up 68 began earlier, 1967 to be precise, and ended in 1975. That's the arc of that radical period that touched the whole world, every single continent. In between, of course, the world was almost turned upside down. For me, the single most experience which formed me, was a formative experience, was visiting Vietnam, former French colony, now being controlled and bombed by the United States, on behalf of an informal war crimes tribunal of intellectuals set up by Jean-Paul Sartre and Bertrand Russell. And the 6 weeks I spent in North Vietnam, often under heavy bombing, we were, of course, very well protected as foreign visitors, but watching the daily use of chemical warfare, of totally indiscriminate bombing of the civilian population. And I remember we had a meeting with the North Vietnamese Prime Minister, and I asked him up front, how can we help you? Should we bring in international brigades from the United States and from Europe and other parts of the world? And he said, no, this is not the Spanish Civil War being reproduced. This is a war fought by the largest, most powerful nation the world has ever known against us. And for us to waste time on international brigades, we would have to protect you, which would divert resources, because we wouldn't want any of you to die. You can't help in that regard because you don't have any experience in using anti-aircraft missiles. We said, well, this is true. He said the best thing you can do is to go back and build solidarity with our struggle. And, you know, I spent the next 4 or 5 years of my life doing nothing but that. So that was the most powerful experience. Of course, there were others. The huge upsurge in Europe, the May events in France, where you saw the largest general strike in the history of capitalism. 10 million workers were out on strike in France, and demanding not just more wages or better conditions, but in many cases demanding autogestion, self-management, the control of the factories. Lastly, very briefly, of course, I was heavily involved in the situation in Pakistan, where in November 1968, a huge uprising erupted, which lasted for 5 months. Struggle, everyone involved, workers, students, women of all sorts, prostitutes came out onto the streets and joined the struggle, clerics, lawyers, and after 5 months of struggle, the dictatorship was brought down. So I say very proudly that the only successful struggle in 1968 was the struggle in Pakistan, which achieved its aims.
Thank you. At the present time, you're 1968, you're living and demonstrating in Britain. We've spoken of the scene of protest throughout the world. It is therefore not illogical to think that you may move on. In 3 years' time, where do you think you're likely to be in 1971?
It's very difficult to say, really. It depends largely on the changing situation. I may be in Pakistan in the midst of a revolution, though I rather doubt that. But I think I may well be in Latin America.
You feel great sympathy with the aims of Guevara?
Yes, I do. If I felt I could be of any use to the guerrilla movement in Guatemala or Venezuela, which is well on its way, I think, to winning more support, precisely because the regimes in Venezuela and Guatemala are very repressive, semi-fascist dictatorships. If I felt I could be of any use to these people, I would go there immediately. But what they need, really, are not demagogues or orators. What they need are doctors, engineers, technicians, or just hardy veterans, neither of which I am, unfortunately.
Yet?
Yet, yes.
Politically, how do you describe yourself now?
I would describe myself as a Marxian socialist, but a libertarian Marxist who doesn't support the deformed regimes in Eastern Europe, who believes that Marxism is compatible with humanism, that Marxism believes in total freedom and cultural freedom and political freedom and various other things. I think lots of people describe us as utopian. And incidentally, these are also the views of the socialist movements in Germany, in France, and Italy, and various other people. But I think in the long run, we will realize our objectives. It won't happen tomorrow. It might not happen in 5 years' time. But ultimately, I think we will win.
Tariq, you first. And then Angela, what lessons do you draw from 1968 for the current conjuncture of war, austerity, racism, and neoliberalism? How, in these times, can solidarity be constructed?
It is really pleasing to be in Paris on a sunny May day and see that many universities are occupied, including in Paris. We know them, this university, Nanterre, the Sorbonne, other institutes of learning. And at the same time, we have a huge railway workers' movement against the neoliberalization of the French railway system. And the connection between railway workers and students meeting each other, talking to each other, it's difficult not to be reminded of 1968. So that's very pleasing. On the other hand, we have a ruling elite, which of course is no longer as complacent as it used to be, because of the 2008 Wall Street crash, which really disrupted the smooth flow of the capitalist system. People thought there were no longer any problems. But this has created austerity measures, it's encouraged racism, it's encouraged attacks on immigrants in virtually every single country in Europe. It's seen the growth of the far right. That's not exactly what happened in '68, but that reflects and contextualizes the period in which we're living today. And all this is creating counter movements. It's not that nothing is happening. The occupation movements, which jumped from the Arab world to the United States, to Spain, to other parts of the world, opened up something new. Very important, but you do need some politics. Because if you don't come in with some political approach and some political program, people stronger than you on the right go into that vacuum and try and take it over. And the wars, there's very little solidarity with the Arab peoples, whose countries are being devastated. Nearly 2 million dead in Iraq. The Syrian war not treated seriously. And all these wars produce refugees. So at the very least, the citizens of Europe should say to their rulers who are making these wars, and of course in the United States, that every time you fight a war, agree to take 100,000 refugees in every single European country and 500,000 in the United States.
I will focus more on how these solidarities were organized, because I'd like us to also think about the impact of feminism. During the era of the 60s, 1968, and around that period, there were a lot of gender struggles over gender that were unfolding within these organizations that helped to produce these, massive demonstrations of solidarity. At that particular time, the struggles were largely over who did the work and who constituted the public face of the movements. And you know who did the work, who has always done the work, right? And you know those who were the public, who constituted the public face of the movement. I mentioned that I was a member of SNCC. SNCC in Los Angeles ended up being dismantled precisely as a result of the fact that the women refused to simply be the ones who did the invisible work. So I would like to think that there's a continuity with the insistence today that we think about organizing and leadership differently, that we don't have to rely on the old masculinist models based on individual charisma, based on a kind of individualism that precisely replicates the neoliberal approach. If you consider the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement that has emerged, the movements against Trump, after all, it was a women's march. Black women, Latina women, indigenous women, Muslim women, as well as working class white women, queer women, trans women. So in the process of engaging in this organizing, we've seen the importance of questioning and criticizing the categories that we use, such as the categories of gender. This is why I was saying before that I'm sort of glad the revolution didn't happen in 1968, because we would still have enormous problems on our hand, perhaps problems that we would be less capable of addressing than we are today.
Cubans and talking to the Vietnamese in Cuba, who said that they see us as the most important force in, trying to eradicate oppression throughout the world. And they see us as their most important ally, because we are, so to speak, living in the belly of the monster. And if anybody can do anything, we can destroy him internally. And they are really counting on us. And this is one of the things that sort of made me feel inadequate, because, I feel that we have a long way to go in this country before we can talk about, being involved in a struggle like the people in Vietnam. I mean, really heroic struggle that the Vietnamese have put up, for so many years seems to me to be almost superhuman. And the struggle the Cubans put up in order to throw out American imperialism from their shores. And I think that we have to start talking about taking the offensive. And I don't know, just one small remark in relationship to my case. When they asked me at UCLA whether I was a member of the Communist Party, one of the reasons I didn't take the First Amendment or the Fifth Amendment, because I felt that it's time that we stop hiding behind such things as constitutional guarantees, and we start attacking the problem where it is. So essentially what I said is, yes, I'm a member of the Communist Party, I belong to an all-black collective which is struggling for black liberation, and I'm going to tell you that I'm dedicated to fighting you, and I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to be honest. But if we don't fight now, we'll never be able to put into practice that slogan, which I think crystallizes what we're talking about, and that is all power to the people.
How do you think, in your mind, could 68 have turned differently? And how would the world look if it had? Can the historical memory of 68 help us to imagine a better future?
I really don't know how 68 could have turned differently. I'm not a person who likes to be inspired by nostalgia, but sometimes I find myself wanting that kind of solidarity again. Wanting that sense of closeness with people whom I never had a chance to meet and probably never would have a chance to meet. And I should also say that a couple of years later, I don't know if you know my story, but I ended up needing some solidarity myself because I was, facing capital punishment, and people all over the world, including here in France, especially here in France, joined that campaign to free me. So I take solidarity very seriously. And I think that somehow the very technologies that are designed to promote, expand communication sometimes militate against the production of these solidarities. And I'm not criticizing social media because I said sometimes if we had access to social media during that period, we probably would have made the revolution.
So the last question, and we're going to start with Angela.
Would you please ask Tariq a really hard question?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Tariq, for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. But I want to ask you a question about Palestine. I would like you to talk about how it is we can, how can we better incorporate a kind of hope for justice for Palestine into our contemporary movements. And so where do we go during this period? And how can we generate hope around the question of Palestine and for the world?
I've noticed, Angela, that people often talk about Palestine, Israel, as very difficult, very complex, not easy to understand. I don't feel that. I think it's a very simple question. And I think the solution is relatively simple too. Why is it a simple question? The struggle in Palestine is a struggle by a people. It's now we can say it's the oldest colonial struggle in the world. That's how the Palestinians look at it. That's how people in most parts of the world look at it. If you look every year when the UN General Assembly votes on this issue. So what's happened? What's happened is this, that as time has passed and Israeli governments have become more and more right-wing, intolerant, they have lost any interest whatsoever in a real solution in the region because they want it all. Eretz Israel. That is what they want. And that is not going to work unless they wipe out the Palestinians, because the Palestinians are not going to give up. So what to do? The Israelis used to say, stop the violent struggle. The Palestinians said, apart from groups they can't control, we've stopped it. But you still won't talk to us. So the Palestinians said, we will have a non-violent struggle without any violence, which is a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the Israelis said, no, we don't accept that either, it's anti-Semitic. And the Israeli lobby in different parts of the world denounces the BDS campaign as anti-Semitic, in some places is trying to make it illegal, but the campaign has gone on. And I honestly urge those who want some element of justice in Palestine to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign on campuses in places like that. No one wants violence in this case because we know the answer to that already. People being killed. Gaza is a ghetto. That's what the only description for Gaza, it's a Palestinian ghetto, where Israeli soldiers sit on hills and shoot at demonstrators like this. And I'll tell you something else. Shocking though it may be, it's hardly ever reported, a systematic campaign to kill young children, especially boys, and reduce the size of the Palestinians. That also goes on. And Europe sits down calmly and accepts this, because the leaders of Europe, all these center politicians, don't have the guts to do anything. They could do a lot more, but they do absolutely nothing.
Maybe I can ask my question in English. It's for Angela Davis. And I want to know, you said earlier that you were glad somehow that you somehow lost the revolution in '68, or the '68 revolution didn't succeed. Could you explain, what you meant at that point?
How you did every day of your life, you woke up and you started making militantism. Were there moments when you wanted to just stay home and...
Merci.
Well, first of all, thank you for the questions. I said that I'm glad we didn't win the revolution in '68 with a sense of irony, of course, because I would have welcomed more substantive transformation than we actually experienced. And in terms of the second question about whether I sometimes want to stay at home, of course. But, everybody gets tired sometimes. And so you rest. You rest for a little while. There's nothing to say that those of us who are organizing for change don't need to rest. But it has never occurred to me that I could live a more meaningful life, that I could live a life filled with greater pleasure if I did not continue to engage in these struggles for social justice. When people ask me that question, I simply say, activism should be a way in which people learn how to live their lives. So it's not about, I'll do this for 2 years and then I get tired, so I'll stop. But it's also about learning how to find pleasure and joy in the work that you do.
Donc, on vous remercie. On remercie le Théâtre des Amandiers. Et évidemment, Angela Davis et Tariq Ali pour leur formidable